Everyone, good evening and welcome to the final session of the day. We have Dr. Graziano Krätli from the Yale University speaking to us on Indian poetry in English. And Professor Krätli is very closely associated with Indian Writing in English Online, our web resource, the first online educational resource on Indian writing in English anywhere in the world. And before we begin the lecture, may I introduce Dr. Krätli formally? Dr. Graziano Krätli is the Digital Projects and Technology Librarian in the Divinity Library at Yale University and is also one of the project consultants for Indian Writing in English Online at the University of Hyderabad. His contributions to Indian Writing in English include 3 edited books on Srinivas Raiparole, which are titled Why Should I Write a Poem Now? The Letters of Srinivas Raiparole and William Carlos Williams, 1949 to 1958. Angular Desire, Selected Poems and Prose 2020, and Random Harvest, Selected Poems and Prose 2022. He has worked as the managing editor at Encyclopedia Britannica in Chicago and has also contributed to a history of Indian poetry in English edited by Rosanka Chowdhury in 2016. He has also contributed several critical biographies of Indian English poets for Indian Writing in English Online. A couple of years ago, Professor Dr. Krätli was here at the University of Hyderabad and had delivered the IOE lecture and was also associated with the Srinivas Raiparole Poetry Prize and had lectured at the Department of English in 2020. So may I now invite Dr. Krätli for his talk. Sir, please.
Thank you very much, Atul. I will start right away. I entitled this talk, the prompt was on reading Indian poetry in English, and I entitled my talk, Reading, and in parentheses, Not Reading Indian Poetry in English. And I will explain why this not reading soon. The beginning starts with a quote, which is, to reach heaven, you need first of all to be a perceptive reader. This is critic Tim Kendall writing a book review on Robert Frost. So I would like to begin with a couple of remarks. One is about reading in general and reading poetry in particular. The other concern the label or construct Indian poetry in English and the latitude of its cultural qualifier Indian. Concerning poetry and literature in general, I suggest 3 basic types of reading. Reading for pleasure is the most private and leisurely form of reading, unrelated to any specific purpose, activity, or goal. A PS, don't trust anyone who reads poetry for self-improvement or social betterment. The second type is reading as a teacher or a student. That is, reading for the purpose of teaching and learning how to read, poetry, for example, or anything else. The third type, and we are progressing in order of importance for our talk, reading as a scholar or a critic. That is, reading for research and publication is the type of reading that defines the professional and overlapping figures of the scholar and the critic, as distinct from those of the teacher or academic. Although many teachers are also scholars and critics, and most academics are. To quote George Steiner, the intellectual is quite simply a human being who has a pencil in his hand when reading a book. I reckon that you, as graduate students, are largely representative of the second category, as practitioners of a form of reading that will enhance your scholarly work, sharpen your critical skills, hopefully without affecting your attitude towards pleasure reading or lessening your enthusiasm for it. And there is a real risk. The more you read professionally, as a scholar, as a critic, as academically, the more you activate mechanisms that take you away from the simple, innocent, childish in a way as a child would read, for pleasure only. Based on the above, we could say that reading makes the reader more than the other way around. And one is not so much what he or she reads as how they read. Also, one cannot be a common reader and a scholarly or a critical reader at the same time, although one can be one or the other at different times and under different circumstances. Although I suspect the scholarly or critical reading may affect pleasure reading in what may be called a loss of readerly innocence. While focusing on the reading, we shouldn't disregard the reader's background and how it may affect the overall experience of reading, whether it is for pleasure, educational, scholarly, or critical purposes. This background can be personal, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, age, disability, medical or psychological conditions, cultural, geographic, linguistic, religious, social, economic, or professional, and it typically incorporates aspects and elements of all three groups. Among scholarly and critical readers of Indian poetry in English, for example, we can distinguish between 1. Indian academics affiliated with an Indian institution, like you, for example. 2. Indian academics affiliated with a non-Indian institution. 3. Non-Indian academics affiliated with a non-Indian institution. Or 4. Non-Indian academics affiliated with an Indian institutions. Each representative of these four groups will have a different take on the subject they teach, research, and write about. The difference will be tinged to some degree by their cultural and professional background, as well as, of course, by other personal circumstances. More broadly, a Western scholar or critic will read Indian poetry in English differently from an Indian scholar or critic. Just like a Western scholar or critic whose native language is not English, like myself, and whose cultural background and education are not British or American, will approach it differently from both an Anglophone Western and an Anglophone Indian scholar or critic. Of course, the same could be said of Indian scholars and critics who tackle non-Indian subjects. These differences, however small, tend to affect a reader's understanding and appreciation of the poems and the poets he or she reads. Different readers read differently, not only because of the type of purpose of their reading, but also as a consequence of personal, cultural, and professional circumstances, their composite background. In short, a particular reading of a poem may, to quote Clive Wilmer on Ted Hughes' translations, arise from engagements in the reader's inner life that are beyond comprehension. The role, however small, that such a background plays in the scholarly investigation and critical analysis of poetry, or for that matter, any other literary form, is rarely, if ever, acknowledged, and perhaps it shouldn't figure in our assessment of a scholar's or a critic's achievement. Yet, both common and professional readers respond differently to different poems and types of poetry depending on their distinct personal, cultural, and professional background, their individual makeup, as well as their immediate circumstances, which may affect their mood, their level of attention, their critical alertness, etc. Exemplary scenarios are legion, but let's keep it simple and close to this writer's experience. And here's a quote. "The fisher folk embark each day at high tide. Their movements are as natural as the sun's. Dark and skinny boys with lanky limbs lean over the boats and cast their nets." A reader born and raised in a large, landlocked European city may respond to the archaic atmosphere of the quatrain above, particularly the mild exoticism of the word fisher folk, in a way and to a degree that a Mumbaikar will not. For example, that is, they will take it for granted. At the same time, another European who, like myself, has fond memories of waking up in a high-rise in South Mumbai, listening to the sound of collie fishermen beaching their boats, is likely to respond in a more personal, even sentimental way than someone who has never been to India, and this in turn may impact his reading and appreciation of the poem, possibly sharpening or perhaps softening his critical approach. So much for the reading of the poem. As for its writing, it is reasonable to assume that a similarly nostalgic feeling inspired these lines, as indeed the entire poem, which was written by a Bombay-born poet now living in Manhattan, and the poet is Visham Berwani. After dwelling on the types of reading and readers, let us now consider the subject with which poetry reading is here associated. In its most comprehensive and inclusive acceptation, Indian poetry in English indicates poetry written in English by Indian residents, non-Indian residents, non-resident Indians, or NRIs, or overseas citizens of India, OCIs. These are all categories and definition from the Wikipedia articles. Non-resident Indians are Indian citizens, this is a quote, who are not resident of India, while overseas citizens of India are people of Indian birth or ancestry who live outside and also are not citizens of the Republic of India. Overall, this is a comment that I would like to add. Overall, Indian poetry in English is preferable to Indian English poetry, since Indian English refers to a group of English dialects spoken in India and among the Indian diaspora. Although Indian writing in English provides copious examples of Indian English, it is simplistic, reductive, and ultimately misleading to characterize all Anglophone poetry written in India or by Indians as Indian English. I was reading yesterday some poems by Nissim Ezekiel, and especially those that are categorized as Indian English poems, and I realized that they work, the idiom works much better in fiction than in poetry. In fiction, you have the possibility of developing a character and building on it, and you don't have that in poetry, unless you write an epic poem or a narrative poetry. Non-resident Indians and overseas citizens of India make up the so-called Indian diaspora, which includes many poets who, because of their ancestry, birth, or citizenship, may fall in more than one national literature. For example, Daljit Nagra and Vidyan Ravindran are British poets of, respectively, Pakistani and Sri Lankan descent, although Ravindran currently resides in the United States and may eventually become a US citizen. While Moniza Alvi and Imtiaz Darkar, both born in Lahore, are usually referred to as Pakistani British poet and Pakistani-born British poet, respectively, and Kartika Nair, born in Kerala and living in Paris, is a French Indian. Sujata Bhatt was born in Ahmedabad, grew up in Pune, emigrated with her family to the United States, and now lives in Germany. In fact, it is not unusual to encounter any of these poets in anthologies and studies of both British or American and Indian poetry, and rightly so. The main takeaway of this brief detour is that in a world characterized by mobility, impermanence, and intellectual nomadism, scholars and critics should focus on the cultural, linguistic, and literary aspect of a poem or a poet, and leave citizenship and residence issues to statisticians and bureaucrats. At this point, we may ask if reading Indian poetry in English is different from reading non-Indian poetry in English or any other language. I suggest it is not. The difference, if anything, is between reading poetry and reading poems, rather than reading Indian and non-Indian poetry in whatever language. What is poetry anyway? And I'm referring to the word poetry in this case, and not the art of poetry. An idea, a literary form, or a catch-all definition serving the practical and normative purposes of classification and content management. A poem, on the other hand, is a concrete, linguistic artifact, a text that can be written and printed, typically on paper or other suitable surface, or read aloud and recorded in another preservation and circulation format. Additionally, a poetic text can be painted on a wall, projected on a large screen as part of an art installation or a music performance. In these cases, readers are simultaneously viewers or listeners whose aesthetic experience overlaps that of a museum or a concert audience. And the PowerPoint presentation has some images, rather interesting, of poems written on walls in Paris and in Leiden in the Netherlands. Now I'm going to quote Harvard scholar and critic and poet Stephanie Burt. There is a thing called poetry, a history of ways to arrange words that are not limited to those words' meanings, and that often involve, among other patterns, verse lines. In the same way, there is a thing called music, in which tones and rhythms are produced on purpose in patterns by human beings. Well, we don't listen to music so much as we listen to Beethoven or Beyoncé. We do not learn to cook in general, but to cook pasta or omelets, bibimbap or pho. We do not play sports, but play basketball or skate. And I do not read or study or write or teach poetry so much as I read and teach the work of individual poets who write poems. This was the end of the quote. As graduate students in an English degree program, you will most likely read poems for the purpose of writing a research paper or a thesis or teaching an undergraduate course or even selecting material for an anthology or a magazine issue. All these scholarly, pedagogical, and editorial purposes require a certain knowledge of the context of the poems you will read in the form of literary and cultural history, biography, etc., combined with adequate critical thinking and a good understanding of how poetry works. These three requirements are equally important and naturally interconnected, as a working knowledge of poetry's formal techniques will hone your critical skills, deepening your understanding of what you read, and help you build a judgment of it. Of course, your sensibility and subjectivity play a significant role in the appreciation of what you read, but alone will not achieve the type of analytical reading that is expected of you as students and scholars. One may be a natural-born reader and a lover of poetry without having a thorough understanding of how poetry works. However, things may change if one has to write about poetry instead of simply read it, for example, for pleasure. And they will change even more if one has to write professionally about it as a scholar or a critic, rather than as a student. In this case, reading involves, indeed requires, an adequate knowledge of poetic form and devices. One is not simply reading or reading simply, but actively probing the text by going over as well as under it repeatedly and from different angles and perspectives. To begin with, the text as it appears on the page, which is how we usually encounter it. Typography and layout provide the first visual suggestion of poetic form, an umbrella term that covers practically all technical aspects of poetry. The 10 poems I selected as reading materials provide a few eloquent examples of typography and layout in poetry. Then comes punctuation and lineation come next, and they are the first indication of syntax, or the way words, phrases, clauses are arranged to create well-formed sentences. And this is the Oxford English Dictionary definition. The arrangement of lines may be stichic, that means consisting of sequence of lines of the same length, and meter, such as most poems written in blank verse. The examples are Milton's Paradise Lost, Wordsworth's Prelude, Tennyson's Idylls of the King, and several Browning dramatic monologues. Those are all single lines. Or stanzaic. The stanza is a group of literally 4 or more lines arranged according to a definite metrical scheme. A simple way to experience and appreciate the syntax of a poem is to rewrite it as prose. Here are 4 examples. Unfortunately, I'm going to read them, and you don't see the layout on the page, which you would see in the PowerPoint, but that would be fine. First example is, the door was open, period. The second example is, why now not be naked, you naughty Western woman? 1 line. The first and the second are actually opening a poem. The third example is from our Secunderabadi poet Shunisha Rayapur. Shared we such a room on Sherman Street? And the fourth example is, stay there on screen, admiring data pool from some satellite string. The first 2 are single lines of verse, each one opening a poem. Both are technically prose, except that the second example is complicated by that naughty now, and its alliteration is more common in and characteristic of poetry and prose. Why not be naked? Why now not be naked, you naughty Western woman? The third example can be rewritten as prose, but the result, we shared such a room on Sherman Street, fails to engage the reader in the same way and at the same level that the anastrophic version does. As for the fourth example, its meaning is very much dependent on the 3-line structure, and any attempts at rewriting is like removing a card in a house of cards. It would only cause it to collapse. If typography and layout provide the external structure of a poem, syntax represents its internal structure. Their interplay is the creative focus of concrete poetry, in which the way words, phrases, clauses, and sentences are arranged on the page, or as mentioned above, any other suitable surface has clear syntactical consequences, and vice versa. The syntax acquires new powers of visualization. As a result, the content and the meaning of a poem tends to be defined by its form, which in turn is driven by its visual and physical or material dimension. The concrete poetry, there is at least one example in your samples that I prepared, but it can also be written on a brick, on shapes that are different from the bidimensional shapes of a wall or a sheet of paper. Regardless of its materiality, content and form are the 2 complementary aspects of poetry. What you say and how you say it, basically, as indeed of any other literary form or work of art. A couple of mirroring definitions will suffice. The first one is from the English scholar Terry Eagleton. Roughly speaking, what we call content refers to what the poem says, while form refers to how it says it. The second is from the author, academic scholar Thomas Ford, author of another manual on reading poetry. Most often, form is opposed, whether explicitly or implicitly, to content. Content here is what the poem is about, its subject matter, while form is understood as a containing structures in which that subject matter appears. Content is what the poem says, form is how it says it. Basically, it ends with the same definition that Eagleton ended with. The third again is Eagleton, expanded. Form concerns such aspects of the poem as tone, pitch, rhythm, diction, volume, meter, pace, mood, voice, address, texture, structure, quality, syntax, register, point of view, punctuation, and the like, whereas content is a matter of meaning, action, character, idea, storyline, moral, vision, argument, and so on. Both form and content are potentially tricky, as they can affect and manipulate our analysis or an interpretation on what we read. Some of us may prefer traditional forms to free verse, so there's a subjective element, or be partial to certain types of poetry, for example, confessional, lyric, experimental, etc., or be moved by certain subjects, perhaps because they are closer to our personal experience, and feel cold or even indifferent towards others. In general, we should resist the temptation to read certain poems biographically, other historically, or politically, ideologically, simply because their subject is biographical, or historical, or political, ideological. Or we should consider form whenever content captures our attention, and pay more careful attention to content whenever form seems to be foregrounded. In other words, when form seems to drive the poem, we should wonder where it is aimed at. And when content dominates, we should question how this is achieved. Likewise, we should be aware that form and content may diverge in ways that challenge or defeat our expectations, as when a traditional ballad form of rhymed quatrains is used to depict a contemporary reality in blunt language. At the same time, let's not forget the popular and vernacular, if not vulgar, origins of the ballad, which in the case of a poem such as V by Tony Harrison may be the most appropriate form. Some of the formal aspects of poetry are interrelated, or more so than others, and some authors stress their relationship by describing them together. Terry Eagleton, for example, combines tone, mood, and pitch, intensity and pace, syntax, grammar, and punctuation, and rhythm and meter. Leonard, which is another author of another book on how to read poetry, on the other hand, has separate chapters for meter, form, layout, punctuation, lineation, rhyme, diction, and syntax, but each of these chapters discusses secondary and related aspects of the main form. For example, register is discussed under diction. Tone, and then I'm focusing on one aspect only to give you a few examples. Tone provides a good example of one aspect of poetry that is associated, on the one hand, with the oral dimension of literature, sound, voice, modulation, pitch, and on the other, with the realm of psychology, attitude, mood, feeling, state of mind. And I have three definitions of tone, actually no more, 4 or 5, but they are short. Oxford English Dictionary, a particular quality, pitch, modulation, or inflection of the voice expressing or indicating affirmation, interrogation, hesitation, decision, or some feeling or emotion, vocal expression. A second definition by the Oxford Dictionary, a particular style in discourse or writing which expresses the person's sentiments or reveals his character. Also, especially in literary criticism, an author's attitude to his subject matter or audience. The third definition is from the Penguin Dictionary of Literary Terms and Literary Theory. Tone is the reflection or a writer's attitude, especially towards his readers. So here's attitude is repeated, but with a specifically meant, especially towards his reader. Manner, mood, and moral outlook in his work, even perhaps the way his personality pervades his work. The third definition is from Eagleton. Tone means a modulation of the voice expressing a particular mood of feeling. So tones can be arch, brooked, dandish, lugubrious, rakish, obsequious, urbane, exhilarated, imperious, and so on. But it's not easy to distinguish tone in poetry from mood, which the dictionary defines as a state of mind or feeling. The fourth is from a scholar, a professor of poetry at the University of Birmingham, Andrew Hodgson. Tone is a diffuse, slippery concept. It can reside in a poem choice of language, its use of form, its approach to its subject. Incidentally, Andrew Hodgson wrote probably published the most recent book as a Cambridge Guide on Reading Poetry. And the 3/4 of the books are about expanded definition and examples. And then there are 2 examples of reading specific poets, 2 chapters. One is the poetry of Emily Bronte, and the other is reading Srinivas Rayaprol. And I think I'm responsible for that choice. It's a strange choice for a British academic. Emily Bronte is understandable, although she's not famous as a poet. She's more famous as a novelist. But then Srinivas Rayaprol, I was surprised that Professor Hodgson even knew Rayaprol. But then I realized I edited Angular Desire with Vidyan Ravintiran. And at that time, Vidyan was teaching at the University of Birmingham. So he was a colleague of Andrew Hodgson. Then he moved to Harvard. So that explains why Vidyan was working on editing the book with me, probably talked to Andrew Hodgson about Rayaprol, and he got interested, and he decided to include a chapter on, which is very unusual for a British scholarly book to have an entire chapter or a less known Indian English poet. Each of these 3 examples, which are actually 4, I should update the paper, below actually, we're moving forward, shows how a particular tone is established through a combination of such formal aspects and devices as lineation and punctuation, syntax, voice, diction, alliteration, mood, pace, rhythm, imagery, even rhyme. The first shows a 23-year-old Arvind Krishna Mehrotra writing under the influence of Allen Ginsberg. I'm so used to your cities with a chain reaction of suburbs where whole families live in bathrooms and generations are pushed out of skylights and the next one sticks out its head like a tapeworm through frozen shit. The second example is Eunice de Souza's sarcastic reminiscence of a Roman Catholic upbringing in Bombay. Happy emerges from cold bean, bottles under arm, face a smirk. Hot stuff, he says. The gathered goons giggle. The third is Dom Moraes writing to his mentally ill mother in one of the most direct and poignant poems written in the second person by an Indian author. I address you only, my lonely mother, where 7 islands squat in a filthy sea, you say your rosary. Before considering specific formal aspects, we may want to establish whether the poem may consist of fixed or free verse, and more specifically, what kind of poem we are dealing with. Is it a sonnet, a sestina, a villanelle, a ghazal? Is it a lyric, dramatic, narrative, or prose poem? An ekphrastic poem? Is it concrete, confessional, experimental, Dalit, feminist, LGBTQ, or protest poetry? The list of genres, types, and forms of poetry may continue. However, you will find that the majority of postcolonial Indian poetry in English is in free verse and open form, but also that most, if not all, the categories mentioned above are represented, and that metrical patterns have been used by Indian poets since they started writing in English. Of course, you don't need to juggle all poetic forms and devices with each poem you read, just like a carpenter or a mechanic won't use all the tools in his shop for all jobs. However, you will find that most aspects, such as typography and layout, lineation and punctuation, syntax, diction, tone, imagery, feelings, etc., are more or less relevant to all poems. I would say they are almost inevitable. A good exercise is to take each of the samples provided and see which of the formal characteristics mentioned above apply and how. That is, how much or how little this helps you understanding and appreciation of the text. For this, you won't need to know who wrote the poem. or when it was published and where, or by whom, and therefore I chose to omit such indicators until later, which is today. I will probably send you the list of sources. The identity of an author, in particular, the authority it grants the text, is such a conspicuous and powerful factor in the evaluation of a poem that its absence may result in a more objective and even-handed critical approach. Reading a single poem, a collection of poems, or even a poet's complete works may be laborious, yet it is not enough. It is also important to read what others have written before on the same subject as a result of their own reading, if available and relevant. Whether we agree or disagree with their views, and disagreement may be more constructive and enlightening than otherwise, it will give us a sense of the critical response that our text elicit, and perhaps also a better understanding of the text themselves. This retrospective approach, fundamental for a scholarly reader and always beneficial to a critical one, is what I would call reading vertically, which should be complemented with horizontal reading, or reading poems by non-Indian authors, whether in English or in English translation, and ideally in their original languages. Reading horizontally, by the way, is what poets normally do. And Indian poets in English have always done, expanding their literary and cultural horizon from Victorian and Edwardian England to modern Europe and modernist America, and eventually beyond. If on the one hand we actually read poems rather than poetry, on the other, reading means more than just reading a poem, a poetry book, or the works of a particular poet. We can read a situation, read into something, or read a friend like a book. All these and other idiomatic expressions imply that to read may also mean to analyze, to understand, and to interpret a fact or a sequence of events or large amounts of documents and data. We also should distinguish between reading text and reading paratexts, including the various and overlapping contexts underlying the creation, material production, circulation, and reception of literary works. Therefore, we can see Indian poetry in English as the totality of poems that were published, are being published, or will be published in English by resident or diasporic Indians. This is a field that can be defined, explored, mined, and assessed as such, as well as comparatively, although its boundaries are often, and I dare say increasingly, blurred to the extent that individual poets can be, and often are, assigned to one or more national literatures based on their residence, birth, or ancestry. In fact, I would go so far as to call Indian poetry in English the first and foremost example of a literary genre that transcends or erodes linguistic, cultural, and especially national boundaries. So we can actually read Indian poetry in English, only not in the same way we read poems, and not with the same tools we use in this type of reading. For instance, we can apply both a close and a distant reading to individual poems and poets, but it is difficult, if not impossible, to undertake a close reading of Indian poetry in English unless we focus on its constituent parts, namely individual poems or poets. To give you a sense of what reading Indian poetry in English as a field might entail, I suggest a few possible areas of research. One concerns the evolution of a canon by looking systematically, that is, statistically and analytically, at print publications, periodicals, individual collections, and anthologies over a set period of time, let's say the first 50 years after independence. The same line of inquiry can be pursued by investigating critical approaches to Indian poetry in English in Indian and non-Indian scholarship. Another line of research is to consider the role of translation in the evolution of Indian poetry in English from the Bengali Renaissance onward. In this regard, India has a unique advantage over other countries. Unlike Argentinian, Finnish, German, Korean, or Russian literature, and the list of possible examples could go on and on, Indian literature is not defined by or limited to one national language, but exists in at least 24, both classical and contemporary, of which English is simply one of the most recent. So if India translates less from abroad than, say, Italy or the United States, it is also because of its rich internal reserve, spanning from the Veda onward and representing great linguistic and cultural diversity, from which translators can draw, and Anglophone poets in particular have drawn and continue to draw with creative acumen and increasingly original and compelling results. All these possibilities require large amount of data, involve statistical and computational methods of the kinds most commonly associated with digital humanities, and envision scholarly readers equipped with appropriate resources and skills, including advanced applications and related know-how. In other words, readers like you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Krätli. Would you take questions or comments from the audience? Dr. Krätli, can you hear us?
I can.
Yeah, thank you for the lecture. Would you take questions and comments from the audience?
Oh, you want to question me? Of course, yes, of course.
Yes, sure. Questions, comments?
Atul, are you reading questions that come through the chat?
Yes, I'll read it, yes.
Okay, thank you.
We have Professor Subarno Chatterjee from the University of Delhi who has posted a question, and I'm reading it. About the loss of readerly innocence, perhaps pleasure is enhanced by critical insight and vice versa?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I would definitely agree that you may lose what I call the readerly innocence of the reading for simply for pleasure without any other commitments, but you gain a sort of intellectual pleasure, which is not what the scholar and the critic mostly enjoy. And also it comes with the pleasure of being the one who develops original concepts, not that it gets it right while maybe his predecessor got it wrong. There are all kinds of pleasure related to intellectual activity. Yes, I definitely agree.
Hi, I hope I'm audible. I had recently read a poem. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, thank you. I had recently read a poem / short story, or I don't know what you can call it. Even the author doesn't know it. It's by Deepak Unnikrishnan, and he sort of has a book called Temporary People on migrant, especially Kerala migrants in the Gulf. So he has a whole chapter about, he describes, it's written, the layout is in prose format, like from left to right, just like a paragraph. And he starts out by listing out all the jobs that, he starts out by listing all the jobs that Carolan migrants do in the Gulf, like policeman, watchman, driver. He lists it out, and in the end, he says a cog, a cog, a cog. Like it's a whole prose. But when reading it, I was thinking this is poetry in some sense. It's not prose. So how do you, or do we even do we even have to confront such questions or of genre per se when reading such things? Because even the book itself, it was titled a novel, but it doesn't have a novel characteristics of a novel, but at the same time, I felt like it was poetry, especially some chapters of it. So, how do you confront such confusion with minor, especially when we have more freedom?
Well, one thing that did you ever try to, if you look up, of course, a poem, a novel, short story, prose, poetry, these are, as I mentioned, these are all definitions and labels that are largely, I mean, they have intellectual resonance, but they're largely for practical purposes. If you go into a bookstore, I mean, those few bookstores that still exist, you have to go somewhere according to your interest, and somewhere has to be labeled. So if you're looking for poetry, you have to go to shelves that are labeled poetry. In academia, it's the same. You have to categorize. In a library, I work in a library, categorization, classification are the basic. So they're mostly pragmatic reasons. In reality, it has a lot to do with how the writer approaches her matter, subject, and how the reader perceives it. And the words are in between, the words as printed. If you try and look for you probably all know the famous Vikram Seth's The Golden Gate, 1980s book. That is categorized as a novel. In all possible areas, from the Wikipedia article to actual listing of materials. But it's all in a very complex metrical system that he figured out based on Pushkin, Eugene Onegin, and it's all in quatrain, it's all in stanzaic form. The latest book by my friend Sharmista Mohanty, which is called Extinctions, is all in prose, and it's poetry, but it's categorized as poetry. So I would not worry too much about categorization, but it would be intriguing to, as a critic, as a scholar, when you read the text, like the one that you mentioned that is called a novel, and that would be your critical edge if you had to write a review or write an article or an essay on the author, on the book, to figure out that is actually what is the poetry inside the book that is categorized as a novel. It's not the layout, it's not the structure, it's not the syntax, because the syntax is prose. And then you, as a reader, you perceive it to be poetic. And there are plenty of novels that are basically poetic novels without losing their novelistic structure. So it has to do, it's a very interesting intellectual exercise, what it makes poetry. Everything else points towards the narrative, the novel form. What does it make it poetry? That may be a very personal response. Another critic may not catch it at all, may treat it as a novel all the way through. I'm sure I didn't answer your question, but I hope I gave you some leads.
Yeah, thank you. You have answered the question. As for using it as a research question, it has already been answered, I'm afraid. Somebody has written a paper on it.
Okay, good.
So I was struck by a point that you said that in some ways Indian poetry, when you read it, and it gives you more possibilities than only being national, and you can read from it almost becomes international in some senses, right? So I was thinking in that sense, do you think it's also a product of the colonial past that we share, and that somehow the colonial past that we have gives us that kind of opportunity to read Indian poetry in that light? And second, just a further point, and you said, since you're talking about when we read poetry as a reader or a scholar, where do we situate ourselves? So coming from a space where, let's say, a country like yours, where you might not have had English as you said, as the primary language of discourse. So does that somehow create two levels of readings in that sense, like vis-a-vis how you read and how you read and write English poetry as to like Indian writers who read and write, and who have had that colonial past to write from?
Yeah, very good. Very good question. Well, first of all, British were, I'm not sure they are anymore, but they were a country of merchants. It was a very commercial society. And they created, not only in India, but in other parts of the world, they created networks, commercial networks. And using the language as a vehicle, they established the foundation for circulation of information. In the case of literary output, books, texts, using the language. So even after the independence, as you know, Indians went to study abroad, mostly in England and also in America, and now other parts of the world. So those were actually channels or networks created voluntarily or involuntarily by the British colonialists. The possibility that generation after generations, Indian went to Oxford or Cambridge. Then there is a question, so definitely you wouldn't have the popularity of Indian writing in English abroad, outside of India, without the language and without the distribution, the circulation networks established by a commercial society like the British. Everybody always focuses on the language itself, which is of course basic, fundamental, but they never consider the networks that a commercial society like the British society created and allowed words to circulate, text to circulate. The French colonial power was very different. If you study West Africa under French colonial rule, and they were much more, let alone Italy in East Africa or Libya, there was absolutely no networks that favor the circulation of text. And even in France, I would say that African authors, Francophone, French speaking and French writing, started to circulate basically by moving to Paris as students and scholars only after the independence of their countries. So it was a much more limited circulation structure, while the British, being by nature a commercial exploiters, they created these networks that continue today. You wouldn't have the literature itself without, not only without the language, but without these networks that then were increased after the Second World War. Then there's the other thing for the other part of your question, which I understand correctly, has to do also with translation of how perception of For example, in a country like Italy or even France or Germany, most likely you encounter Indian writing in English in translation. And Italy translates a lot. France a little bit less, but Arun Kolachkar was translated by my friend Letizia Zecchini in French. I translated Arvind Krishna Mehrotra and other authors in Italian. It's very different. It's a very different encounter if you read a poem or an author in translation. You basically read two authors at the price of one, because the translator is an author in himself or herself. But the fact of being written originally in English, I would say, favors the process of translation and the publisher's decision to translate. I don't have statistical data, but I suspect that Indian English authors are much more translated abroad than Tamil authors or Bengali authors who write in their own languages. The first thing is that because of the specialization, how many Italian graduates know Tamil? It's a very specialized area, and they mostly focus on ancient classical literature. Well, no, 1 out of 2 probably has a good knowledge of English. So it's more likely that an author writing in English is translated abroad than an author writing in another Indian language. Did I answer your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you for your talk. And my question is about the category of Indian when we look at Indian poetry in English. So I was thinking of poems like A Country Without a Post Office, Aga Shahid Ali. And the question is, there is a serious discontent and a sort of contestation with the idea of whether they want to be identified as Indian. What do these poems do in the, like, how uncomfortable are these poems in a kind of canon of Indian writing in English?
Yes, good point. I think that's where the language becomes a sort of substitute home country. Is almost like the Jewish traveling from country to country, and they found the real country in the language and the book. So in the case of Aga Shahid Ali, but other poets too, I think that English as a recent foreign imposed pan-Indian language provides a sort of alternative nationality or a literary nationality. So you're not so much as an Indian, but you are an English language writer and a poet. And if you move abroad, like Shahid did, fairly young, it becomes even more important that your language represents who you are more than your nationality. As I mentioned before, leave alone nationality. It doesn't make much sense anymore in today's world. The concept of nationality is culture and language are much more important. And writers are more sensitive to the importance of language and culture than and culture as ingrained in language, because language in itself is just a pipe, it's just a communication tool. What makes it relevant is is the fact that it's a cultural entity that actually defines who you are. And even if, especially Indian English, that quite often the writer has layers of other languages, one or two languages that are the languages that he spoke when he was growing up as a child, and they interplay with English, or they provide a cultural background which English then expresses, and that comes to specific things like a choice of one word or a construct or a syntactical form rather than another. You don't realize it, but they're actually influenced by your other language and your cultural background. So that's why, you may be uncomfortable about your nationality. Means history, means politics, means countries fighting each other, means exploiting each other. Well, a language is a much more personal instrument, even a language that is recent import like English to India.
Thank you, Dr. Krätli. Any more questions, comments? Dr. Krätli, I had a question of my own, if you wouldn't mind.
Please, please.
Do we need to debate, my question is, do we need to debate the limits of Indian poetry in English? And I'm coming from the history of the genre. Mary Elise Gibson, of you, I'm sure, you would be aware of her. Mary Elise Gibson has a volume called Indian Angles, and the subtitle is Anglophone Poetry from Jones to Tagore. And it's interesting that she includes people like William Jones in the 1780s and 90s, and people like Derozio and Rabindranath Tagore, all in the same canon. And I found it fascinating, much like Arvind Krishna Malhotra's book on the history of Indian English literature has a chapter on Kipling, and as well as Varya Elwin, who are not Indians by birth. As in Kipling was born in India, but then by ethnicity they were not Indian, but they have contributed to Indian writing in English. So do you think we need to debate the contours, the limits of the genre itself?
Yeah, that's very interesting. There are books, anthologies, or that focus on what is called Anglo-Indian poetry, and then there are books that focus on Indian poetry in English written by Indians, and then there are anthologies that combine, that starts with William Jones or these guys who were actually officers, British officers of the Raj, who, and you have the same situation. You have the same, which is actually would be interesting to compare. You have the same situation in West Africa. There are the French colonial officer who is posted to a location and doesn't have plenty of times, not much responsibilities or duties, so he becomes interested in the language and the literature and the folklore and the culture of the area, and becomes a specialist. I have a few names, I'm not going to mention them, of French colonial officers who are authorities on some aspect of West African Islam or African culture. And so those are the equivalents of William Jones. I don't think that if an anthology of Francophone African poetry or African literature would include them. They're not African. I don't think William Jones can be considered an Indian just because he lived most of his life there, and just because of his important as a scholar and translator. Kipling is a slightly different story, but I think it's still part. The birth, place, it's important, but no, I don't think it is enough to make Kipling an Indian poet. At the same time, I think separating strong separation doesn't help intellectual investigation. If you kind of throw them all in the same pot, it helps comparison and contrast much more. It's much more friendly to intellectual investigation and scholarly research than separating drastically. But at the same time, I don't think William Jones is an Indian author, and neither Kipling. I really start my literary, if you can call it literary career, by translating Kipling in Italian like 40 years ago.
Thank you so much, Dr. Krätli. Any more questions, suggestions, responses? Dr. Krätli, we come to an end of this session today, and we would be happy to meet. Thank you so much for the wonderful lecture, which was at the same time a survey of the genre as well as a fairly technical, a technical analysis of the various aspects of poetry itself and Indian poetry in English in particular. So thank you so much for the lecture, and we would be delighted to meet you at the meet you online for the interactive session as well as the workshop for the participants. So until then, thank you so much. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you all. Thank you all. See you tomorrow.
Thank you.